Good evening. Are we on? Okay, you guys here? Okay, there we go. Great. For a little bit of tonight, I'm going to have to spin around and point to stuff here, so I'll move there in just a second. But real quick, before we get started, where we are in the text is quite interesting, and given the state of things, it's just that much more interesting. I don't know if you guys have been kind of perusing the news of late, but the other party that was running against Netanyahu, if you remember, since the elections, Netanyahu could not put together a coalition government, so then they went to Gantz to see if he could. And it looked like they were going to try to put together a coalition with the Arab bloc. Netanyahu thought that would be a really bad idea, and he's right. But Gantz couldn't do it either. So it looks like they're going to have a third round of elections. I don't know what else they could do, because they don't have the ability to continue the government as it is. They have to get something put together based upon the vote. So that's going to be very interesting. And then we all know that last week there were a lot of things coming out of Gaza towards Israel after Israel took out the head of Islamic Jihad down in Gaza. And now it happened up in the north, and some rockets kind of came out. I couldn't find out exactly where it was, but I was thinking Quintana and maybe further out than that. And Israel's retaliation went as far as Damascus. So there's a lot of very interesting things taking place, you know. And what you realize when you read the things that are there, you know the intention and why everybody does it. And the one thing that's so sad, and the tough thing about it, and it's one thing that we should probably be mindful of, is the amount of human suffering that goes on along with it. It's so frustrating to watch. The poor people caught in the middle because the leadership is such a mess in all of those places. But we should expect such things. There's going to be that kind of animus between Israel and all the surrounding nations. Oddly enough, it's nothing new, but it's still nonetheless sad to watch. With that said, I had a couple of people requesting prayer. Greg is not here, and so he's got something going on, and a lot of pain that's happening. Things happening in his around his neck and whatnot. So he called and told me that. And then there's this really sweet lady who's a good friend of the ministry down in the Houston area, Barbara Ann, and she's got a lot of back pain and whatnot, or complications from cancer treatment, and some difficulties with that too. So we want to lift them up. And as a reminder to everyone who's in here, if you have things of need of prayer for health and things like that, just come down after we're finished here, and we can lift those things up and pray for God's hand to move in those things. And He does what He does as He desires, and sometimes we understand why, and other times we don't. But we bring them to Him nonetheless, and pray that He would heal. So let's pray for them real quick. We'll pray for the tonight's study. We got a lot on the plate tonight. This is a really interesting chapter. Our bodies were never intended to live forever. But there is one that we know awaits, and we have an eternity that is set in front of us, wherein there will be no friend. When you get to verse, Jesus answers something that Matthew and Mark don't really deal with, and that is the immediate timing of it. Now, we'll point that all out when we get there. There are a number of interesting things, especially in Matthew, because you realize when you read Matthew 24 and 25, there's actually two chapters kind of dedicated to the discussion. In Matthew's record, it's more so than Mark's, and it will talk about a variety of things in much more detail that Luke doesn't even touch, like things that will happen during the tribulation. The abomination of desolation is mentioned. When you get into chapter 25 of Matthew, there are a couple of parables that go along with it, and then things that are really more in the second coming part of it. In Jesus' response tonight, you're going to find that there are things that you could say that took place within a generation or so of his time. Now, there are other things that he speaks about that, unless you're just going to be really loose with your interpretation of it, there is just no way that they took place anywhere near that time. And so we'll kind of get to those as we go. There's something else from our view and how we will address this. It is the view of myself and of the church ever since I've been here, that there are things even in our text that are future even to our time. And if that's the case, and I believe that it is, obviously, then it's an interesting thing in Jesus' answer. When he's asked the question, then gives his answer, he'll talk about things that happen near future to them, but things that, since they happen to us, already assumes a very interesting thing. It will be the disintegration of the nation of Israel and their displacement, which turns out to be 1900 years roughly, but it also has to assume this, that they will be regathered in the land in order for these things to take place. Because there's no possible way that we can look at this text, if we believe it to be literal, that it could be any other way other than they would have to be regathered into the nation before any of this could take place. That's a pretty interesting and a pretty significant thing. Now, there are some things that I want to bring up for you as we get into the text tonight. So let's get to chapter 21. And I want to address a couple of things before we move too much further into this. Within the church and within the different beliefs in the church, there are some people that take the view of the things that we're looking at tonight, and they believe that all but the last part, that Jesus returns to the earth, was already done. It's already taken place, and it really kind of had its culmination in 70 A.D. when the Romans pretty much sacked Jerusalem and really the nation as a whole. It's what's called the preterist view. Preterist, from the Latin, meaning that it's just a loose translation in English. It's already happened. It's in the past. Okay. That being the case, then that means a number of other chapters also must be seen as being past tense. There are a couple of chapters in the book of Daniel, chapter 11 at verse 31, chapter 12, verse 11, both mention a thing called the abomination of desolation, which you will find in Matthew's version of this, chapter 24, that's mentioned as well. Those two abomination of desolations that are mentioned there in Daniel, the one that's in the 11th chapter, is speaking of a guy named Antiochus Epiphanes. And that would be the guy that went in during the Maccabean time, and he went and defiled the temple. The one that you see mentioned in chapter 12 is a whole different guy entirely, and you can read those chapters and you can see clearly it's speaking about two separate incidents. The guy that's being mentioned in chapter 12 is the Antichrist, and that abomination that will take place. It's also spoken about a bit in chapter 13 of Revelation, where there is something that is erected in the temple that's never taken place before. So no matter how much you look at Matthew 24 or Luke 21 or Mark 13 or any of those other ones, to take the view that it's already taken place means that you have to take those chapters and make them into metaphor and, some other allegory that has nothing to do with literal means. And it just never fits properly. Well, we go through a little bit of this text tonight, and some of that stuff will kind of come up. So when you talk to a person, how many are familiar with the term preterist or preterism? Okay. If you're not familiar with the term, what it simply means is there's a lot of the text that really must not mean it literally. And that goes for most of the book of Revelation. If you take the preterist view, it's already done. So there's really nothing in the prophetic sense to happen. And there's all kinds of other, problems that go along with it, though I'm not even going to mess with it tonight. But this chapter that we study, there is much of the church that believes that there's really nothing future about this, aside that they do believe, most of them, that Jesus will return at some point. But there's nothing in the prophetic sense between here and there. So with that said, chapter 21, this is the same discourse that is given, as I said, in Matthew and Mark. And so what we have here is just simply this. Luke deals with a portion of it that is not dealt with in the other ones. So what we have is kind of, once again, that mosaic that if we were to take a look at those three places where it's dealt with, John doesn't even touch this. But Matthew, Mark, and Luke, if you take all the unique pieces and put it together, they fit really nicely together. You just have details given by each of the writers that you have a little bit more than what would be just if you were only reading one of them. Mark is pretty similar. It's an abbreviated version. Really, if you take Matthew and Luke and put them together, you have a really rounded out picture. Luke will talk about much more of the things that happened very near future to this, about a generation, and then Matthew deals with a lot of things that are still future. So with all that said, chapter 21, what we looked at last week, the 4 verses at the beginning of the chapter is dealing with a woman who was there and gave her tithing, and Jesus made a reference to it about that she gave more than the others. And we wanted to keep that with last week because at verse 5, this changes everything of the direction of the discussion. Now, he's there in the last week of his life, right? We're all familiar with that. Triumphal entries happened. He's just days away from going to the cross. Now, at verse 5, it says this: "Then as some spoke of the temple, how it was adorned with beautiful stones and donations, he said, 'These things which you see, the days will come in which not one stone shall be left upon another that shall not be thrown down.'" Now, that's the general thing that he says. Luke points this out, that it was said in a very general sense to a number of people. Matthew then goes on and will say that they came to him saying, "Hey, we heard what you said," and he gives some more detail about they were saying, "Look at this and look at that." And so it transitions from being an open group to disciples. Now, so again, if you look at both of them together, you'll see that. Now, what I want to look at is this idea that not a stone will be left. When we get to Israel, there's an interesting thing. And I'm going to turn this sideways for a second so I can look up at the pictures. And then I'll get back. All right. So, the photographs I wanted to show you tonight. This is what we call the Temple Mount. I have a couple of other pictures that kind of, it's bigger. What you're looking at right here is the southwestern corner of what's the Temple Mount. So you hear that mentioned all the time. We'll have a picture from back a little further, and it'll help you to see it. But this thing right here is kind of significant because of some of the photos that will come later. That's where a thing that it is known as the Robinson's Arch is attached to what is the Temple Mount. Now let me do one thing here really quick, because how many of you guys have read that there is a dispute as to whether or not the temple was actually here or further down in the city of David towards the south? We've heard that whole thing? Okay. I get it. I understand that. But here's the thing that's so interesting to me. If that's the case, then there is a lot of archaeological stuff here that would give the impression that something very significant to the Jews would have had to have been taking place here. If the temple is not located here, then what you see here for this arch is really kind of an interesting thing, because there would be no reason for there to be that kind of an entrance, because you would have the southern steps and a number of other things. And what you find at the base of Robinson's Arch, if you walk around there, you'll find places where merchants would have been, and even mikvahs. We all know what mikvahs are. It's the ceremonial washing place. You'd walk down into the water and then walk back out. If there's no temple and there's no functional place for a corporate worship, there'd be no reason for those things. Now that's at the base of Robinson's Arch, and you can go there today and you can walk through the mikvahs and back out. So this is the southern portion, that corner right there, and you can see this here obviously does not look new, does it? Or look old, rather. These down here look quite old, and you can see them. The stones are entirely different. That is Herodian for this part here. Now let's go to the next one. Okay, so same wall, and this is what we had just looked at. This is the continuation of the wall. This is the very iconic area, what we call the Western Wall, or where people go to pray. So you're on the western side here, and there you see what they call the Dome of the Rock. Now that's not a mosque, though you have things that take place there. If we went over this way, there's one with a black top, and that's called the Al-Aqsa. And so that's at the southernmost portion of what's called the Temple Mount. Most people would speculate that the temple would have been just to the north of this. If you're looking at it from above, it would be just a little bit to the north. Because again, this is the western wall, south. Over here would be the east, and up here is the north. And so the temple, they believe, would have been placed a bit more this way, if that is the Temple Mount, and I do believe it is. Here's why. Let me do two things. The reason for me saying about the mikveh and all the rest, again, this had to have had some kind of ceremonial things going on at it, or none of that stuff would exist, as I had said a little bit earlier. When this happens in the future, I don't care, some of you heard me say this, I don't care if they could prove tomorrow that the temple is somewhere else, and they could prove that it stood somewhere else. I can guarantee you this, when the time comes that they want to rebuild it, they're going to rebuild it here, and you want to know why? Because of that. Did you see what I just did? Because of this right here, the Jews are going to want to make sure it's on that property. All right. Let's go to the next one. Now, here it is at night. Robinson's Arch, western wall down here. Over in this area would be a little further down there is that western wall. We just looked at it. Are we all still together on where we are here? Here are your places where there would be the merchants, and down here are the mikvahs, if you walk through them. I have lots of pictures, but I don't want to make this, let's go to church and look at slides night. So anyway, these right here, believe it or not, that carried water. Those little things right there, that's what they were for. They're indentations, and water would run down from north to south. Let's go to the next one. Okay. Again, more of these things, Robinson's Arch. And you can see where people would walk through. The mikvahs are right here behind us. These are all the places where the merchants would go. So next one. So let me read this again. Then some spoke of the temple and how it was adorned with beautiful stones and donations. And he said, the things which you see, the days will come in which no one stone will be left upon another, and that shall not be thrown down. Isn't this interesting? Because that caved-in street and all this debris is really what you have of Robinson's Arch, and it was part of other things that happened there at the time. And so you can read the historical accounts of what took place there, that the destruction of the temple was not, from all that we can tell, not really a thing that they had intended to do, though it happened. And because of all the things inside, that's why you hear that they would take it all apart, because as history records, when the thing burned down, all of the metals that were of importance and of value went in between the rocks. So how do you get at them? Take the rocks apart and extract the metals that were burned and melted. But isn't this interesting? Look at how caved in that is. And here they removed it and they put it all over there. But this is right underneath the arch. You see that right there? That was where it attached to the temple, and it would have gone over to here. So everything underneath this would have had some stairways that went back and forth, and they came to here, and they could have got up to the Temple Mount area. And so when it's all broken down, this is what it ended up doing to the street. There's remnants of what's Robinson's Arch. And that would have happened elsewhere in the other parts of the complex when things got broken down. So Jesus makes it a point. They're blown away at how beautiful everything. Look at all the architecture and all the rest of it. And Jesus says, wait till you see it in a little while. My paraphrase. Was that it for the photos? Okay, that's it for the photos. Now, let's bring up the two slides real quick. The first one, I just wanted you to get that to kind of go over where these things are kind of dealt with. And I know some people like to take pictures of these things. I have them, so if you want, I can even email them to you if you're interested. But what you have are the commonalities in the verses. So as the looking at the temple complex, what we just looked at, that was kind of what started it. They were looking at, ooh, look at the temple. Look at these things. And Jesus said it's going to come a time. So here's your parallel verses, whether it's Luke or Matthew, and then the timing of it is dealt with in both. Luke goes into much more of the immediate timing. Matthew looks more towards the times to come in the timing of things. Then there's the warnings that are pretty much the same And that is the first one is deception, where the question becomes, when will these things? And he says, well, let me tell you what will be going on. There will be deception is the first thing. Do not be deceived. So we'll read that in just a moment. Then the other warning of wars, rumors of wars, famine, pestilence, signs in heaven and earth. You have both of them talking about those. Then the warnings of persecution. The persecution that Luke deals with is almost primarily dealing with what happens at the time that it's going to be destroyed within some 30 years of Jesus saying this, less than 40 years. Matthew only deals with the abomination of desolation as far as this discourse is concerned. Luke doesn't record it, but it was all said at the same time. Let's remember that. So if you read between Luke and Matthew and you think, well, he didn't record that, and the other one says, well, they didn't record it, put them together. It's the same discourse. You can tell that by the way that it's introduced and some of the commonalities between it. If there are little bits and pieces left out, it's because that wasn't emphasized by that particular gospel writer, but they're not different times of saying different things to different people. It's all the same discourse. And the other passages that go along with this, again, if you want to know about the abomination of desolation, it is Daniel chapter 12, verse 11, not to be confused with the chapter 11 of Daniel that is speaking about the Greek guy Antiochus Epiphanes. Okay? That happened between Malachi and John the Baptist in that period of time when the Greeks before the Romans came in. Are we clear on that? Okay. The witness that you'll do in persecution, that again is something that you can kind of look to the book of Acts when those times were coming and the things that would happen after the fall of it. And so anyway, you'll find that he talks about those. Those are unique to Luke. The second one of these, the second coming is dealt with in both of them. As you see there, both of them deal with this parable of the fig tree. I'm already looking at the clock and realizing there's just no way we're going to get through this tonight. And then the idea of waiting. There is the watching and waiting that you see addressed in Luke. It's a little different that you find in Matthew, where he goes to the point of saying that no one knows the day or the hour. And that's picked up a little bit by Luke when you see Jesus' discourse after his resurrection in the first chapter of the book of Acts. Okay, so if you kind of want to see how those pieces all relate and work together, you can. If you want these, you just want to be able to do your side-by-side and you weren't able to write those things down or take your picture with your phone, let me know and I'll send it to you. All right? And I should say, again, like I said, Sunday morning, don't get used to me doing stuff like that on the board. All right. So, did we get through everything here? Yeah. Great, Chris. Let's get to the Bible. Great idea. Let's do that. All right. So, let's get again to verse 6. These things which you see, the days will come on which no stone shall be left upon another, and that shall not be thrown down. And so, notice there's a bit of a transition. And especially you pick this up a bit more in Matthew's gospel, where they ask him after they've gone, and then they say, when are these things going to take place? In fact, let's do that real quick. Let's go to Matthew 24. So, let's see. Look at verse 1 of chapter 24. Then Jesus went out and departed from the temple. That was where he first started to say those things. Okay, he was teaching in the temple, and so his disciples came up to him to show him the buildings of the temple, and Jesus said to them, "Do you not see these things? Assuredly, I say to you that not one stone will be left upon another that shall not be thrown down." Now, as he sat on the Mount of Olives. So that was, as they're going out, looking at those things, they're on their way to the Mount of Olives, which is where he starts to say the rest of these things. So kind of a change of place. Verse 7, so they asked him, saying, "Teacher, when will these things be, and what sign will there be when these things are about to take place?" Now he says to them, "Take heed that you are not deceived." very similar to what you see in Matthew at the opening parts of this, right? So starting with verses 4 to 14 in Matthew. So he said, "Take heed that you not be deceived, for many will come in my name, saying, 'I am he,' and the time has drawn near, therefore do not go after them. But when you hear of wars and commotions," or wars and rumors of wars, as Matthew says, "do not be terrified, for these things must come to pass, but the end will not come immediately." That's the important part. Now, there's not a whole lot of discussion. Does that mean, well, these things could start next week and then not immediately? Does that mean like the week after or the month after or the year after? Well, we're actually talking millennia plus, almost 2 of them, before this could even begin to take place in its fulfillment. But you're going to notice that Luke will record where he addresses directly the things that will happen in about 35 years, roughly, 37 years, however you want to account for it, depending on how exact you want to be. Now, but the end will not come immediately. Then he said to them, "Nation will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom, and there will be great earthquakes in various places, and famines and pestilences, and there will be fearful sights and great signs from heaven." Now, here's one of the reasons why it's important that you look at this. Okay, great. You want to say, when did this take place? Here is when you start to say, all right, I can see where part of that happened, but when did that happen? And so when you start to try to look for historical events that took place, you're really kind of struggling to try to find a place where you had signs that would take place. Now, when you know that we are in the tribulation, and you look at the stuff from Joel chapter 2 that Peter talks about in Acts chapter 2, when there is like, moon to blood, all the Revelation kind of stuff, I mean, that's pretty obvious that is being spoken of in a very literal sense. And, I mean, the Bible would say that there is a time when the earth will shake and everything that can be shaken will be shaken. And that's never taken place, right? So people would have to say, well, it's being spoken of in metaphor, or it's being spoken of poetically, or it's being spoken of in some analogy. Okay, great. Well, what is it? Because I'm certainly not seeing it in any historical sense. Well, here he mentions these signs in heaven. Now, in verse 12 is where you start to see a little different recording from Luke that is different than what you see in Matthew. So here's what it presents to us. From everything that we can look at, especially in the description of things, it's pretty obvious that Jesus is talking about things that will happen before the final of them. And you get that in the latter part of what we're looking at here. So verses 12 to 24 are pretty unique to the way that they're portrayed in Luke, though they're kind of loosely related. Verses 12 to 19, you'll see a little bit of that in Matthew. So let's look through it. Verse 12 says, "But before all these things," what all things? All the stuff that is the signs in heaven and all the rest. He's already talked about the destruction of the temple and all that. That certainly happened at the hands of the Romans. We do know that a war will also come to Israel again, future. But there doesn't seem to be the same kind of destruction that's spoken of Israel, but there will be enormous persecution at the hands of the Antichrist if we believe Revelation and other chapters and other books are speaking literally. So, verse 13. He says that, or verse 12, "But before these things, they will lay their hands on you, they will persecute you, delivering you up to the synagogues and to the prisons, and you will be brought before kings and rulers for my name's sake." Now that's certainly something that has taken place. Ask Paul. That happened to him, right? So the idea of going before the officials and all the rest of it. These are the things that will happen before that takes place. So if we look at the destruction of the temple as being something in 70 AD, did all of these types of things take place before that? Sure. Peter, Paul, John started out first of all going before the Sanhedrin and all the rest. Especially when it came to Paul, he went as far as Rome and all the way before Caesar. So, "But it will turn out for your occasion for testimony. Therefore, settle in your own hearts not to meditate beforehand those things that you will answer. Whether it's Peter and the guys in chapters 3, 4, 5, even when it comes to Stephen in 7, and Peter when he does the things he does before Cornelius in chapter 10, none of that stuff was scripted, remember? They were just asked questions and they relied upon the Holy Spirit. We have a great one, it's chapter 4, where it says Peter was asked this question, and then being filled with the Holy Spirit, he gives his answer. So he didn't say, well, excuse me, let me turn to my notes. Instead, he's able to be used as an opportunity for witness. So we see this all throughout the early book of Acts. We see it all the way through Paul's ministry. And certainly, though we don't have a lot of record of it, we know that John had gone through a whole lot of things because he's writing at the end of the first century. When he wrote his 3 epistles, when he wrote Revelation, and when he wrote his gospel, it was at the end of the first century, and he was in a place of exile. Now, let's see if we all agree on this. You don't get put in a place of exile unless somebody puts you there, right? Okay, just so I want to make sure we're all on the same page here. So, verse 15. For I will give you a mouth of wisdom which all of your adversaries will not be able to contradict or to resist. Again, we see that happen consistently in all of the public witnesses that you see recorded for us from Paul's epistles to the book of Acts. You see this repeatedly happening, that they were, even the most educated people were totally confounded by the things that took place. It's that chapter 4 in Acts, I believe. I love it where they're listening to what Peter had to say, and they're looking at he and John and whoever else would have been there, and said they looked at them and they realized that they were uneducated and untrained men, but they couldn't even begin to answer them. Really frustrated them. I love that. Well, in verse 16 it says, now you will be betrayed even by parents and brothers, relatives and friends, and they will put some of you even to death. Now, Jesus has said this to them on a number of other occasions, and he says similar things in Matthew. That's where you'll see a little bit of an overlap, where he says, that there'll be even within families, people betraying one another. And this will be something, remember, when you read that in Matthew, here, Luke kind of deals with it more in the immediate future, not something way down the road, though he will get to that. Now he says in verse 17, and you will be hated by all for my name's sake, but not a hair of your head shall be lost. Well, wait a minute. Didn't he just say some of you people you'll be put to death? So how is it that he could say you'll be put to death, but not any of your hair will be lost? That means in the eternal sense. Now, nothing will happen to you in the eternal sense, though they might put you to death here. You will not be abandoned, is basically that thing. Your death will not be the final of things. You'll be preserved in the eternal sense through it, even if it costs you your life here and now. So, and by your patience possesses your soul. Isn't that a cool thing? Endure it, basically. You're going to have to endure this. Do so with patience. And in doing so, it's the way of saying that of the possessing of your soul, it's not losing your mind over the whole thing. You're going to have to know that this will take place. Be patient through it because it's only for a time. But not a hair will be lost, though your life may be taken. Be patient in these things and not looking to preserve yourself. Don't worry about what you're going to answer. You'll be given wisdom on what to say at the time when it's needed. So he does all of this. Now look at the transition. But when you see Jerusalem, now if we look at this as Jesus answering the question, remember they asked, when will these things take place? What will be the signs? That was the question that was asked. Matthew deals with those questions that happened after the first one. Jesus here is dealing a lot with the timing. So if we understand this the way it seems to lay out, basically what you have in verses 12 to 19 is the kind of the book of Acts kind of stuff. But what's going to happen when you see this? But when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that its desolation is near. That seems to fit really nicely with what we know from history. You saw the pictures of it. That's what happened at the hands of Titus Vespasian. So that works really nicely with this, because that's exactly what happened. The Romans came. There were a lot of people that were, rebelling against Rome. Think about this. Why did they want to have Jesus be this political savior? Because they were up to here with the Romans. But he told them over and over, I'm not here for that. I'll come back as that king, but I'm not here for that now. Well, that rebellion that was in them culminated, and it kind of came to this point where this is what took place with Rome. Now, when this comes to take place, the panic that would take place also, and you can read this in the historians, we know that many of them fled into all of the surrounding areas. When we get to Israel and we go to Masada, Masada was the last of the places to get wiped out because it was so remote and so difficult to get to. So it was some 3 years after Jerusalem fell that they finally got to Masada. And it was only because they were just so probably angry with what was happening at Masada, they built a ramp out to it. I mean, that's pretty crazy stuff. If you want to see, there's a great picture of it. Down the hall as you're going out this way, right out in front of the nursery, there's a picture of Masada. And you can see the encampments that the Romans put all around it, and then they built a ramp coming out of the mountain to get up to it. Crazy. They were just so insane at that point. Well, verse 21, when this comes to take place, when the armies are surrounding Jerusalem, when you see all this, let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains, and let those who are in the midst of her depart, and let not those who are in the country enter. So Jerusalem is not a place that you'd want to be. Now, it's an interesting thing, but we don't see it as often, or we don't see it anymore because I don't know about you, but I don't love touristy places. But there is this really interesting house that you can see that they excavated in the old city of Jerusalem. And it's what they call the burnt house. And it's right there in the middle of the old city, but they found it in an excavation. And they've, dug it all out. And you can see the burn marks in the stone from when it was burned down. And everything in that room with all of its artifacts are first century. So really, kind of Jerusalem wasn't just the temple, but Jerusalem was sacked. It was trashed. And you go into this room and you see everything is burnt. It's called the burnt house, and it's a tourist kind of a thing that you sit through, a presentation and all the rest. But that you find all over the place, burn marks all over the place. Well, verse 22, for these are the days of vengeance, that all things which are written may be fulfilled. So this would be a prophetic matter, not just Jesus' words, but the fact that God would have his people displaced so that he could bring them back. It was a chastisement for their rebellion against him. I mean, there is a lot of prophecy, if you will, about these events, and Jesus alludes to them right here. But woe to those who are pregnant and those who are nursing babies in those days, for there will be great distress in the land and wrath upon its people. Yeah, imagine being in that place, especially in that vulnerable position of being pregnant or having to take care of an infant. It'd be horrible. Well, verse 24, and they will fall by the edge of the sword, and they will be led away captive into all nations. That is a hugely important verse. Because if people would say all of this is being spoken of as the end times, what we know about this is that the displacement that will happen in the end times, Israel's not taken away to foreign nations because there would be no time to regather them. At the end of the tribulation, Jesus comes back and he puts down whatever rebellion is happening there at the time, and he redeems Israel. So this has to be pointing to the things that were taking place in the near future, because that was when Israel was displaced to all the nations. And it was that way until the middle of the 20th century, when they finally were coming back. There were Jews living in Israel, no question. But the idea that they would be regathered into the land and have a place where they're coming back to that displacement, boy, that works with every prophet that you can point to in the Old Testament speaking about them being brought back. And not just brought back in the sense that a few people showed up. I mean, think about Jeremiah talking about Israel and Judah being regathered into the land. From the time Judah was taken out, just a little under 800 years before Jesus was born, They have not been in the land as a recognized nation. And God said, I will bring them who were taken out first and Judah who was taken out last and bring them back together in their land. Never happened in history until the middle of last century. So with that said, they will fall by the edge of the sword and they will be led away captive into the nations. And Jerusalem will be trampled by Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. So here's what we know. If there is this event that takes place, but it's for a time, let's look at the timeline. From the time Jesus said this, when was the first time that Jerusalem could have been sacked and his people taken away? 70. We agree on this? So if that was the case, and it would happen until the Gentiles' time was done, has that ever taken place? Some would say, well, yes, because Israel's back in the land. Okay, I can see why they would make that argument, but when we go visit there, the Gentiles are not gone. In fact, if you want to go up and visit the Temple Mount, calling the people that are up there and harassing the people, calling them Gentiles, kind of is frustrating because I'm a Gentile and I'm nothing like those guys. But they hassle everybody up there, and that is the Temple Mount. So I can see how some would say that's, when Israel comes back in, and let's be honest with this, if they wanted to start a big major war, Israel could go up there and just remove all of those people and get them out of there. And from time to time, they do have to clear things out. Maybe sometimes you've noticed in the news where they've gone in and they've found all kinds of weapons and all kinds of things that have made their way up onto the Temple Mount. But Israel doesn't make the offense of it, though the time will come, certainly. There's going to be interesting history still to be figured out. Well, I wasn't planning on saying this, but another one of the pictures, if you've noticed up and down our hallway, we got lots of pictures of Israel. When you go out this door here and you make your left there, you'll see that there's a picture of a guy and that gold dome is right behind him. That was our guide. His name is Gershon. And at the time, almost as soon as I snapped that picture, the Temple Mount is just across what is a tiny little valley. And so let's see, from where we were standing, it's not much further than probably across the street and maybe double that length. That's about how far it was. And you can hear all kinds of commotion going on over at the Temple Mount. And so people in our group are like, what's going on? What's going on? Is everything okay? And Gershon's just like, they're just mad about something. A Jew must have showed up or something. That was what he said. It's like, that happens all the time. Don't worry about it. Half of our group's going, is a war going to break out? It's like, no, they're just mad about something. Pretty funny. Well, that's the kind of thing that happens there kind of all the time. So to answer this question, the time of the Gentiles, the way that you can look at this and say, when will we know that this is absolutely 100% totally fulfilled, is when the Gentiles have no control whatsoever. That will certainly happen at the second coming, when Jesus returns. So figure Revelation 19, when he returns to earth. So for those people that would say the time of the Gentiles was up when Israel came back into the land, there's an element of truth to that, but they are certainly not done. And so we see it when we're there. There are plenty of Gentiles around, and they are still having their way in some places around Jerusalem because the Jews allow it to be so, just so we know that. Now, verse 25. Now, there will be signs in the sun, in the moon, in the stars, and on earth distress of the nations with perplexity, the sea and the waves roaring. This is fascinating because this is only found in Luke. Okay? Now, this is clearly a tribulation kind of a passage. How do we know that? Because it's the same discourse that you have in Matthew. And in Matthew's discourse, he'll talk about the abomination of desolation. That's the midway of the tribulation. That's when things go completely haywire. So again, in verse 25, when has this taken place? It hasn't, clearly. This phrase that he uses, that there will be on earth distress of nations with perplexity. This is the only place where it's said. It's not in Mark, it's not in Matthew. The words here basically mean this: distress and perplexity. The distress is the world saying, there's incredible trouble and we don't know what to do about it. The perplexity is because they don't know what to do about it. They feel hemmed in and pressured. And so it's like the entirety of the world is in a place of complete angst and nobody has any answers. Now, this again is being spoken of in the tribulation. But I'm sure plenty of you heard me say it before. I am of the opinion that, yeah, the tribulation will be the tribulation, but it doesn't happen overnight, though it's only 7 years long, and really the bad part of it is 3.5 years. Think about what happens in 3.5 years. It happens, a lot happens, but it seems like it goes by that quick, right? We're in election season right now. Our president's been in office for 3 years. Does it seem like it? Well, if you're watching the stuff going on in the House, it seems like forever, but you get it. It goes by fast. So for the world to get in this kind of condition where everybody's going, what do we do? We're feeling pressed in on all sides. It's perplexing. All of our problems have no solutions. That doesn't happen in 3.5 years. It's not like everything is wonderful and then tomorrow everything goes haywire. It takes a good running start. Take a look at the world around us today. Do you see some levels of distress and perplexity? Yes. But it will get magnified horribly during this time, probably even aided by some of these things that are mentioned here. Signs in the sun, in the moon, in the stars, and on earth. You're going to see this seas and waves roaring. You're going to have the earthquakes. You're going to have all the other things. Remember, he says these are the beginnings of sorrows. There are other things that will take place before. Okay, now we're getting to this part. Look at this distress and perplexities goes on. Verse 26, men's hearts failing them for fear, and the expectation of those things which are coming on the earth, for the powers of heaven will be shaken. And they will see the Son of Man coming in a cloud with power and great glory. Now, verse 26. If you want to know kind of when would this take place? Was there the hearts failing and all this stuff when Rome was doing its stuff in 70? Certainly yes. But the context here is clearly of a different time. Why? Because the very next verse, that they'll see the Son of Man in the clouds. Please tell me when that took place surrounding 70. It didn't. That is when he returns again. Now, what you find, this perplexity and all that's being spoken of in verses 25 and 26, the failing of men's hearts and all the rest, think from Revelation 6 on. Okay? All the way up to chapter 19. That's when all that horrible stuff's going to go on. That's when, gosh, think about it. In the judgments that take place, what is it? I think 2/3 of the earth's population is gone. Dead. 2/3? I think that's what it turns out to be, or 3/4 of it. There's two separate things where you find that the numbers. It's been a while since I've looked at it. But it's either 2/3 or 3/4 of humanity is dead in those years. That's unimaginable. Well, what did we lose in World War II? What was it, 250 million, I think was the number that I thought? That's pretty formidable. But think of 2/3 or 3/4 of 7 billion. In 7 years. Pretty heavy stuff. Well, so all of these things, men's hearts failing them for fear and the expectation of those things which are coming upon the earth, for the powers of the heavens will be shaken. And then at that time they will see the Son of Man coming in a cloud with power and with great glory. Now this is not Revelation, or this is not rapture kind of stuff. I just want to make sure that we all understand that. Why? Because we believe, or I believe, that there is a rapture of the church, and not everybody sees it. The people who know that it takes place are those who are taken up, because we meet him in the air. And it doesn't say that everybody sees him. It says that the church is gathered to him. When you see this taking place, think Zechariah. Think book of Revelation. He steps foot on the earth. War breaks out. Actually, hardly a war. He puts down a rebellion. He puts down a war. Well, they all see him coming in a cloud with power and with great glory. Now, when these things begin to happen, look up and lift up your heads, because your redemption draws near. Interesting. Their redemption. Now, here's one of the things. People look at this and they wonder, well, how can this be? Why is he speaking to them? Well, he's clearly not speaking to them of this second coming, because they're going to be long since gone, right? I think we can probably all agree on this, even though none of you ever answer. None of the disciples are still alive today. Are we agreed on this? At least on earth? See, you guys can, every once in a while, you can pull it together and answer a question for me. Because they'd be like 2,000 years old, and that would be a record. Can we agree? So, yeah, slightly. Now, somebody said, well, they're still alive. Yes, they're alive heavenly, but they're not here. They have no heads to raise up, because they won't be seeing any of these things happen. So there are those people that would say, well, he says you. Okay, you can say you without it being that these people specifically. What's an example? If somebody was to say that they wanted to do this, that, or the other thing, I could say, well, you know, when you go to the store, if you're doing it at night, make sure that the lights are on in your car. That you is for anybody. That's just, you speak of you in the sense of anybody in their right mind when they go somewhere. Doesn't matter what time in history it is, since they've had cars. Have your lights on at night when you're driving. All right, so you get that idea. It's not you as in I'm speaking to you in particular, but you as you're saying, well, when you go somewhere, you do this. All people do that. So that you, it's not speaking, it doesn't have to be speaking to a person. There are times, of course, when the Bible would say you, and it means directly the person that's being spoken to. Context is everything. Okay? So, clearly he's talking about an event that's never happened historically, and they won't be there themselves to see it. Who is he then speaking to? The people who would be alive at that time, who would be looking. Now, who's going to be in the tribulation that would be looking up for their redemption? The people who have not bowed the knee to the Antichrist. Well, where will they be? I don't know. He doesn't go into all of that. He doesn't give us a lot of details. But to the people who will be looking for him, you know that there will be a whole bunch of people that will come to faith. Read Revelation. There will be a lot of them that are going to be martyred. There will be a lot who will look to avoid the things that are going on. We know that the number of those people, the multitude, is, you can't calculate it. So, again, Revelation goes through all of that stuff. Again, he's not being incredibly specific here. He's speaking in very general terms. So whoever's there, when these things take place, if he's not coming back as their judge, look up, because your redemption draws near. So, let's see. Time. Yeah, we can do this. This is not difficult. Here's another one of those places in the text where there's been a lot of misunderstanding in this. And even around Calvary Chapels, this is one of those things where I think there's a lot of space here for us to look at this different. Because, and let me just read it. This is the parable of the fig tree. It's mentioned in the other Gospels as well. Now, Jesus, in using a parable, is clearly speaking in the way of metaphor. The fig tree is supposed to represent something. Now, there was a very popular view of this. It's getting less popular as time goes by, because we're still here. The fig tree, as this goes, represents Israel. And so when you see that take place, then know that it's going to happen. And he mentions a generation. The problem with that is that when you start to think of generations, yeah, we've gone a long way since Israel's come to play. They got there in 48. Or even if they say, when did they take over Jerusalem? 67. That's still 50 plus years or 70 plus years. Generations don't usually run that long. So, there are people who still hold to that what's being spoken of in metaphor here is the nation of Israel. It can also mean this. It's just being used in metaphor sense to tell you about a period of time. When these things take place, it's just like a fig tree. In here, you'll see that Luke says, or other trees. What that just simply means is that Any trees, you pretty much know what time of year it is by looking at them, right? We have a great example of it right here in our very front yard, very own front yard. That little Japanese elm, I believe is what they call them. At this time of year, it's dropping leaves like crazy, and it makes the people that have to take care of all that stuff nuts, because it's a huge tree and it drops a ton of leaves. But come January, come December, when everything is off of it, that thing looks dead as a doornail, doesn't it? You would think that that thing hasn't had a leaf on it in 100 years. Come back in March, and it'll look just like it does now, with all kinds of leaves and everything else. You can tell what time of year it is by simply looking at the tree. So here's your two options. The fig tree, is it speaking about being the nation Israel when it comes back, and you can tell because the leaves are now back on it because it's been gathered in the land? Or is Jesus just saying, look, when you see these things taking place, it's like a tree. You know what time it is by looking at it. So here Jesus says, look at the fig tree and all trees. All trees. When they are already budding, you see and you know for yourselves that summer is now near. So you also, when you see these things happening, know that the kingdom of God is near. These things happening, everything that we've studied to this point, especially as it pertains to the second coming passages. Not the stuff of 70, but the stuff that is still future to our time. Assuredly, I say to you that this generation will by no means pass away until these things take place. This is one of those verses where the preterists say, see, all of this had to have taken place, because right there it says this generation. That word for this does not mean the people right there at the time. In the Greek, it can mean a number of different things. It could mean this generation or that generation. Depends on who's being spoken to. And so if it's taken this way, this generation or that generation, the ones that see these things taking place, doesn't have to be the disciples hearing him. It has to be those ones who are present when these things take place. So it can be any group of people at any time. It's the only way to make it fit the context, because there are things that clearly Jesus identifies and describes that have never taken place. But when those things start to happen, those who were alive at the time, that generation or this generation who sees those things, this generation that's being spoken of at the time, surely I say to you that this generation will by no means pass away until these things have taken place. Once they begin to happen, they will happen and come to completion during that generation. Now, because of all the other passages that speak about this, we know that it will happen that way, because it only lasts for 7 years, the day of the Lord stuff, the tribulation. All of what's being spoken of in this section of the book as Jesus says these things. So, heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will by no means pass away. Isn't it an amazing thing that this is, think of who it is that's saying this. The very same one that's about to go to the cross, that will die and resurrect and ascend, is the same one who is describing all the events that will be taking place right before he returns. Pretty heavy stuff. And it really kind of goes on into the next verses, but I don't want to, or do I? Yeah, let's finish out the chapter. Okay. But take heed to yourselves, lest your hearts be weighed down with carousing, drunkenness, and the cares of this life, that day come upon you unexpectedly. In this case, you have watchfulness spoken of in all of these discourses in the three Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And so his point here is watchfulness. Don't get so encumbered with the things of this world and of this life that when things start to take place that you're caught unaware. Now, notice this. He says, for it will come as a snare on those who dwell upon the face of the whole earth. Again, start at chapter 6 of the book of Revelation, and you'll see what happens to the people who are unaware. The people who will be judged, the Bible says in Revelation, mentions the term, those who dwell upon the earth, a number of times. And that's speaking about the people who are being judged. Again, does the church go through the tribulation? I personally don't believe we see a bit of it. Why? Because it is judgment upon the people on the earth. The church is not appointed to being judged. Why would it be? We escape that because of the finished work of Jesus. That is the Lord meting out judgment and wrath on the unrepentant, those who dwell upon the earth. It's not reserved for the church. Why would he judge the church along with the unrepentant, along with the unbeliever? Makes no sense. It's not the way he does things, ever. So, watch therefore and pray always that you may be counted worthy to escape all the things that will come to pass and to stand before the Son of Man. Isn't that interesting? The worthiness. The worthiness has nothing to do with works. It's interesting that it is the same person who is speaking. It is our attachment to him that causes our worthiness. It's not because of us, but because of him. And so when Jesus says, think about it this way. If you were to have a face-to-face with him and he says, you need to be worthy in order to escape those things, any of us would be able to look at him and say, I'm never going to be that worthy. Unless, or to borrow a phrase from the Bible, unless I'm clothed upon with your righteousness, I can't be worthy. I can't earn my way to that. I'm not clothed with my own righteousness. I'm clothed with your righteousness. Those robes that we wear, those white robes, those are because of him. We're granted to wear those, Revelation 19. It is granted to be adorned in that because of his righteousness. We're clothed upon with that. So, that worthiness is tied directly to the one speaking. Kick that one around in your head for a second. The very words that he speaks of that worthiness is only because of him, and he provides for it. Wow. Verse 37. And in the daytime he was teaching in the temple, but at night he went out and he stayed on the Mount of Olives. Remember when Judas finally, we're going to get that in the next chapter, when he finally betrays him? And they said, when he says, I'll take you to him, Luke kind of clues you in that Judas knew exactly where they'd be. That's where they'd been for the past few nights. So he would spend his day at the temple and then walk across the Kidron Valley to the Mount of Olives. I hope that you understand just how close this is. So any of you who've ever visited Israel, honestly, if you're at the, let's say it's the kind of the graveyard that's on the eastern side of the temple there, the Temple Mount, you have just a ditch between you and the Mount of Olives, like from here to across the street and then a little bit more. Not much more. It's crazy how close everything is. All right, so then early in the morning, all the people came to him in the temple to hear him. These are the last few days of his life. This was his life in those days. See, I'll say this one last thing. How many of you guys have heard the term the bucket list? Right? Okay. What's the bucket list? The bucket list is, if you only had a certain amount of time to live, your bucket list is all those things that you wanted to do. Think about his last week on the earth. It was sun up to sundown, pouring himself into his disciples, preparing them for his departure, and ministering the kingdom of God to the unbelievers that some would come to him at that time. Wow. Wow. What a way to spend the last week of your life. Dedicated to them, or as I think it's John that says it, that having loved his own, he loved them even unto the end. Wow. Pretty cool, huh? All right, chapter 21. I'm only 5 minutes late. Let's stand. Let's have a word of prayer. Father, we thank you for your word, and we thank you for the comfort that comes from knowing and from learning your word. We ask, Lord, that you would glorify yourself in our lives, and that we would be people who are dedicated to your word and what you teach us through it, that we would hold tightly to you and to everything that you offer to us. As these days grow darker and darker, we expect such things. And we ask, Lord, that you would help us to walk in a place of integrity and watchfulness, just as Jesus had instructed us all these years ago, that we would be looking for your return. We thank you. We give you all praise. Be glorified, we ask in Jesus' name. Amen.